This is functions and function notation part 2. And we're going to look some more at functions. And remember, part of what we're doing here in this unit about functions is not just figuring out the answer, but being able to learn about that vocabulary and being able to have, just being fluent in the language of functions and function notation. All right, so quick recap, quick review. So remember, x is typically the notation that we use to denote the input of our function. And this right here, f of x, that is the notation for the function's output, right? So if I have a function here, let's call this our f function. If I put in the input x, right, our output f of x comes out, okay? You guys need to really get this in your brain, right? So x is our input, that's what I put in, and then the machine will spit out our f of x, our output, okay? All right, I want to take a look at this example over here. Right, so let's say I have this function, right, and I would read this like this. F of x is equal to 2 times x, okay? F of x is equal to 2 times x. So it's a little confusing because this right here, there's multiplication here, 2 times x. But remember, here, there's no multiplication here. This is just f of x, which stands for the output of the function. Okay, so right down here, I wrote down, what does this sentence mean? Right? If I were to write that out in words. Okay, so this right here, I would read it this way. The output of our function, that's this, the output of our function is equal to 2 times x, which is the input. Okay, so the output is going to be 2 times the input. Okay, so think about what that means. Okay, so imagine if I were going to put something into our function. Okay, so if I were going to put in, let's say, the number 3. If I were to input the number 3, if I were to put the number 3 in here, right? So if I input 3, what would the output be? Well, the output's going to be 2 times the input. So if I input 3, the output would be 6. Okay, and a lot of times we record this using what's called an input-output table. Okay, so this right here is our input, this is our output. So again, if I were to input 3, what would happen? If I were to put in 3 here, this would output 2 times that input. And 2 times 3 is 6. Okay, what would happen if I inputted, let's say, 5? Well, if I inputted 5, this function should output 2 times that input, right? So if I input 5, the output would be 10. Okay, let's look at one more. Let's say I input, I don't know, -6. If I were to plug in -6 into the function would output 2 times that input. 2 times -6 is -12. Okay, so what I want you to understand here is that this table, right, is just a way to record the inputs and outputs, right? So, and it doesn't take away from the notation we've already learned, right? So you could also record this information the way we've done in the past, right? So I could say f of 3 is 6, right? All this is saying is the output of our function when we have an input of 3 is 6, right? Or I could say f of 5 is 10, or f of -6 is -12, right? So sorry about that. This is just an equal sign, not something weird. Okay, so this is just another way to write the same information. So you can record in a table or like this. All right, so let's take a look at this question. Right, so same function, f of x equals 2 times x. Right, our output is 2 times the input. Right, I've got 2 questions here. What is f of -5? And question 2, for what values of x is f of x equal to 24? I want you to pause the video right now and don't answer the questions. Instead, I want you to practice translating these. How could you write these questions in just plain English? Well, what are these questions really asking? All right, so please pause the video, think about it, and write down what you think these questions are asking in plain English. Okay, let's check, see how you did. Here's how I would translate it. Right? So what is f of -5? That question is just asking, what is the output going to be, or what's the output of the function going to be when the input is negative 5, right? This right here is an output. What is our output when we have an input of negative 5? The second question, for what values of x is f of x equal to 24? Here's how I would translate that. Right? Remember, values of x, those are input values. So I would say this. For what input values is the output going to be 24? For what input values is the output of the function equal to 24? Okay? So let's go ahead and answer these now. Now that we've translated, let's go ahead and answer them. Okay? So what is f of negative 5? Right? Well, negative 5 is my input, right? This is asking what's going to be the output when we have an input of negative 5. Right? So if I were to input negative 5 into my function, well, the output is going to be 2 times that input, or in other words, 2 times negative 5. So we can just say this, f of negative 5 is equal to negative 10. Okay? Or if I were to say this in a sentence, the output of our function when we have an input of negative 5 is negative 10. Question 2. For what input values is the output of the function going to be 24? Okay. Well, we know that our output is always going to be 2 times the input. So if I know that the output has to be 24, right, that means that 24 has to be equal to 2 times the input. Let me say that again. Right? We know from our definition here, the output is always going to be 2 times the input. And then our question's asking, basically, when is our output going to be 24? Right? Well, 24, that's the output. That has to be equal to 2 times the output, 2 times the input. So 24 equals 2x, and this is a simple equation to solve. Divide both sides by 2, and so we have an input value of 12. Okay, and if to write this in a nice sentence, we can say this. Okay, the output of the function is equal to 24 when the input is 12. Okay, all right, let's look at this function, g of x. Right, so a new function, g of x equals 3x minus 5. Okay, and I'm going to do the next two with you, and then the last two are going to be you try it. Okay, all right, so here's our new function. The output for g of x is going to be 3 times my input minus 5. Okay? Remember, this is a sentence about the output. The output of our function is going to be equal to this. So what is g of 2? Or in other words, what is the output going to be when we have an input of 2? Okay? So what's g of 2 going to be equal to? Well, g of 2 is going to be equal to, well, remember, our output is always 3 times the input minus 5. So I need to do 3 times my input. Well, input was 2 minus 5. So g of 2 is going to be 6 minus 5, which is 1. Right? So again, all this is saying is the output of our function when we have an input is 1. Okay? All right, and number 4. For what values of x is g of x equal to 13? Okay, remember what this is asking. For what input values, or in other words, what input values is going to give me an output of 13? Okay, well, going back up here, we know that our output is always going to be 3x minus 5. Right? Our output's always going to be 3 times the input minus 5. So when is my output, when's my output going to be 13? Right? It's going to be when 13 is equal to 3 times x minus 5. Right? So we got to figure out this equation. When is the output 13? In other words, when is 3x minus 5 going to be equal to 13? Okay, and to solve this, I would just add 5 to both sides. That would be 18 equals 3x, and I can divide both sides by 3, and we get x equals 6. Okay, so to answer that in a complete sentence, we would say this. The output of our function is equal to 13 when the input is 6. All right, lastly, you try it. Same function, g of x equals 3x minus 5. I want you to do 5 and 6 here, and bring that into class and we'll discuss it tomorrow.